mascots, brains, iconography.
These millennial items of gay and terrible power erupted into a war that threatened to destroy the internet.
When done well, the inspired aesthetics, inspiring stories, and endearing personalities of fiction can bring a bit more hope and joy into a world rife with conflict and grievance. Handled carelessly, though, they can just as easily have the opposite effect. When a bunch of people love a thing but can't agree on how and why it should be loved, or even what makes it what it is, well, conflict's created where there'd otherwise be none. And I don't think there's a better example of that principle than Sonic. He's fast, he's blue, he's got an attitude, and that's about where the agreements seem to end, really. I've been a casual fan and constant observer for most of my life, and despite usually giving people the benefit of the doubt, I'd more or less succumb to the whole haha funny view of the larger fan base. People way too old getting way too mad about a series way too inconsistent to justify the investment they have. Which isn't exactly wrong of me to think, but after 3+ years spent in a Sonic fan game Discord, developing and marketing a Sonic-inspired indie title, talking to Sonic fans about Sonic games, I started wondering, why are they still here? Why am I still here? What did this simple and innocuous story and set of characters do so right, and yet so wrong, evidently?
Sonic the Hedgehog, one of the greatest and most attractive characters ever thought of. He can run at sound speed, take out enemies in a flash, and best of all, he's blue. How to handle the female.
Well, first off, I shouldn't say story. I should say stories. Despite Adventure being seen as some kind of major turning point that divides the classic and modern fans down the middle, a conspicuous themes actually existed in Sonic's persona since more or less the beginning. For Sonic 1, you wouldn't get much more than some lore in the Japanese manual, tidbits of context for kids from the Land of the Rising Sun, and retrospective curiosities for superfans from the Land of the Rising Cholesterol. As is often the case, though, the real story begins not with the first success, but with the even more successful sequel, realizing they finally had an international icon on their hands and not just some one-hit wonder. The Sega suits made their move. Mario got 2 cartoons overseas? We're gonna have 2 at once. Yeah. And while they're still running, we'll also have a comic. And in Europe, we'll have another comic. Now those weren't bad ideas inherently. Pokemon's the most profitable fiction of all time, and that launched with a multimedia push so excessive that I don't even blame people for thinking it was some kind of satanic world conquest plot. Hell, I'm still not sure it wasn't. From the beginning, though, things were very different. Those 2 Mario cartoons I mentioned, eventually 3, they're listed as their own distinct series, technically, but really they were more like new seasons with new gimmicks and a change of scenery to promote the newest title. Sure, the Mario 3 cartoon reversed isekai the bros into real life, and the World cartoon had brainless cavemen and overly literal musical numbers that sounded like this. But for the most part, they were the same. Identical art style, identical takes on the Bros, Toadstool, and Koopa, similar basic moral tale plot lines.
Oh, mama.
Sonic's first 2 cartoons. Sonic's first 2 cartoons couldn't have been more different, not only from the Super Mario shows, but also 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 from each other. But also from the Super Mario shows, but also from each other. Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog was a coked-out action-adventure slapstick comedy. Imagine Looney Tunes if the Dodo Land episode were its base power level and things only got more nonsensical from there. Throw in a Scheme of the Week format powered by a wildly charismatic starfish demon who screams about his junk in Spanish, and you got a 1-season meme machine that was both stillborn and immortal. A bit less than a year later, we get the show simply known as Sonic the Hedgehog, or Sad AM as its fans and I call it. And for anyone who claims the Dark Age games took themselves too seriously and that Sonic in the classic era could never have been that self-indulgent. Oh boy. In this show, a demonic no seriously, what is the deal with giving Eggman a pointy head? Robotnik already has a firm grip on the world. People are getting brainwashed and turned into riboflavin and robotic robotic slaves en masse, and worst of all, Sonic's in a mutually reciprocated relationship. Princess Sally Acorn, this hot, this attractive, active, this tomboyish squirrel girl with a very active role in the story, serves as both the heroic Hedgehog's hot, attractive, tomboy, princess, and the official head of the resistance. If using Bart Simpson Ratatouille to overthrow global communism while courting a dethroned action girl princess don't sound like the epitome of the 90s wet dream to you, art does sound like it has the same target demographic as the first show, then you're frankly way too used to this franchise for your own good. And yet, all the same, it wasn't enough. Neither of these shows, despite their current fame and infamy, rated quite as well as the networks hoped. Sega wasn't about to give up though. They had a third game rolling down the chute, and Europe and Australia had a bunch of cheap Sally Acorn tats sitting around. But what do you do when both of your completely separate and totally irreconcilable promotional cartoons that have nothing to do with your game are failing? Why... Why, you contract a comic series from the creators of Archie to promote not said game, but both cartoons simultaneously, of course. Why was this their strategy? Who knows? But you know what? It worked. No, I don't mean it got either show extended. The first one got 1 season and the second got 2. But this absolute molten mess of a licensed schizo fanfic of a comic book series, it chugged along for 24 years. This dumbass Sonic comic that retooled Holocaust poetry to be about cartoon echidnas. It lived for 24 years. Okay, let's get back on track. Archie Sonic, heck, one of the writers for Archie Sonic alone warrants and already has several hour-plus documentaries all to himself. So while I might touch on it again later in this video, actually, you know what, I'll just put this image up here a while I talk. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, okay, buddy? Okay. The point being, 2 games in, and we're already on 3 layers of promotion with a wide fork in the middle that tapers back down at the bottom. This is a legitimate accomplishment, and the only thing more impressive than the fact it reached this point so fast is that it didn't hamstring its growth. And fellas, that's all before the first Sonic game to even have a real plot. Oh, that's right, the third Sonic cartoon. He's the son of a queen deposed during Eggman's uprising, and he and his twins form an underground rock band to, I don't know, actually. They're trying to find their mom. That's explicitly the objective.
They made a vow their mother will be found. Give up your children, separate. They seek their mother.
I long for my children.
They made a vow their mother. The children grow, learn what's right. Leaders of the freedom fight. Sonic Underground. Sonic Underground.
I have no clue how entertaining these homeless crackhead aliens is supposed to help. That's all you really need to know about it. Nobody cares, nobody cared, the story never concluded, and the best character dies in the first episode. It probably didn't have much of an effect on anyone's perception of the franchise, but it's worth Sonic Adventure! The gaming landscape changes forever about every 10 years, but Y2K was one of the most distinct turning points. It wasn't merely a leap in graphics or monetization, but in storytelling. Huge advances in animation and audio broke dialogue, world building, and character development out of the dreary confines of RPG text boxes and into even the humblest of AA collectathons. Even our good pal Mario gave that whole having a setting thing a spin. Once. Didn't actually go that far with it, but Mario fans are notoriously easy to impress, and that's the one thing I'll give Sonic fans over them. Sonic Adventure, by contrast, went all the way with it. Fully voiced dialogue at every turn, a city hub world with NPC subplots that can get a bit too real, and advance along with time of day over the course of the story. 6 campaign POVs with dialogue retakes to emphasize the differences in how characters see each other. Though sloppily, SA1 more or less established the formula we're all so familiar with now. Mysterious, suspenseful intro, play a few levels, intersperse a short dialogue scene here and there, play another level, get to a boss. Though shorter than a standard level, the boss acts as a narrative checkpoint, preceded by a pair of more substantial scenes. Here, the story's most important players convene around a mini-climax, bouncing their personalities off each other before coming to a realization or learning something that moves the plot ahead. They split back up into their respective groups. Repeat the cycle of gradually increasing stakes until you reach the big finale. Everything from Sly Cooper to SpongeBob would follow in his footsteps, though none of them would do everything it did, and even to this day, little else has. If Rareware platformers were lost in space, Sonic was Deep Space Nine. Okay, maybe more like Voyager, but you get the point.
Whoa, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it.
Consider all that the pre-boss cutscene to me explaining how this game created even more tears in the already frayed fabric. Which isn't to say I hate it. This still remains my favorite era of the Blue Blur despite its blunders. From a certain perspective, you could even see the drastic change in artistic direction as an attempt to cast off the brand confusion they'd already created. A fresh start with these sleeker, more mature designs, and a brand new grounded urban setting. A bigger, more mysterious world that Eggman still hopes to conquer but is no longer going to fall to one man in a toy robot army. Without some outside assistance, anyway. New villains who match and even surpass his threat level, and a better utilized cast of characters with their own stakes, presence, and purpose in the world. Amy's not just a damsel stuck in the middle of some level, she lives in the city, goes grocery shopping. She's willing to put herself in danger to help those weaker than her, despite being one of the weaker characters herself. Tails ain't just a lost puppy who follows his big blue buddy everywhere. He's got his own workshop out in the country where he can work on his countless projects in solitude. I can relate. Knuckles. Well, yeah, he's about the same as ever, but through him we learn way more about the backstory of his race, his vocation, and the reason it's so important, along with just being a bit of a conduit for the lore. I like it. I think it's a more interesting option than just bringing the Genesis titles into 3D, but there's still no denying that it's as different as any of the, heck, 4 different spin-offs that had already carried quote-unquote the quote-unquote story thus far. More importantly, this isn't where it's settled either. To be fair, it looked like it might be when Adventure 2 rolled around. Despite some differences in style and presentation and just not having as much to do with the previous game's plot as it probably shoulda, it took all the changes Adventure made and went all in with them. More urbanism, more modern sci-fantasy realism, more lore, more world building, more grit, more emotion, more stakes, less varied music. But for the most part it was just adventure but more. More different, but unlike in the previous cases, it was more the same kinda different. It was a controversial new direction for the series to be sure, but you know what? At least it was one general story, decently established and ripe for expansion. With 2 well-liked games to firmly base itself in and a younger but no less passionate fan base, the next game was a throwback that simplified the story, brought a character back immediately after giving him a solid send-off, and started on a Green Hill clone. Which at the time wouldn't have been so much tiresome as just kinda odd. Remember, this was 2003. The future was the present and the past. Old games were lame unless you could play them on a GBA, and even if you disagreed, it wasn't that uncommon to see 5th and even 4th gen consoles still plugged into TVs anyway. A whole new breed of mascots were on the rise, and the veterans who tried to bring their old act along wholesale were currently having their workplace injuries exploited by Todd the Tasmanian Tiger for photo ops. Ouch! The arguable most popular animal mascot at the time shot people with guns and had games based around dick jokes. And Sega. Being Sega. Notice. Now, my interaction with the internet at the time was mostly limited to playing my gym partner as a monkey promotional Flash game, so I I wasn't really in the trenches, per se, when Shadow dropped. I was aware it existed, I'd seen ads, but one look at the box art was enough to tell me, yeah, don't even waste your breath asking Mom. And frankly, I don't remember if I cared in the first place. Suffice it to say, though, this seems to be when the majority of people realize their fire-tested battleship had survived the console wars only to be converted into a carnival pirate ship ride, and started questioning, well, a lot of things, but mostly the future of whatever ongoing story it was kinda pretending to tell. I get why they made it, though. Heroes was an unnecessary backpedal at possibly the worst conceivable time, and Sonic, as both a character and a brand, is nothing if not impulsive, so they compensated by Gmod Ragdoll flinging themselves forward and leaving a dent in the office wall. And at that point, they must have realized they were back at square one, because their next move is to square up and make a Square Enix-worthy plot about time travel, hyperdimensionality, and evil god in the end of all things. Sonic 06. This was my formal introduction to Internet Say Sonic Bad, and also the point at which I can no longer defend the series for not really taking itself as seriously as its detractors claim, which serves as a perfect segue into that whole can of worms. Why is it seen as a bad thing when Sonic plots take themselves a bit more seriously or go darker? The answer everyone jumps to is, well, because it's about a blue cartoon hedgehog, duh! Okay, how about that Mario spin-off with a gallows in the middle of its first hub town? Why is that one revered as a beloved black sheep instead of treated as stupid? Because it's about a yippee-wahoo cartoon plumber with a big silly nose and a talking mushroom archaeologist friend. Why is the aforementioned Ratchet & Clank not the pariah of the gaming world for being an unironic critique of consumerism and revenge, while starring a sassy little space cat who makes jokes about butts? Why is Sonic, in particular, expected to shut up and spin dash while his peers can at times literally get away with murder? Is it pure, unfiltered bias? Well, to quote literally Satan the Hedgehog here, the answer's yes and no. You know how I said it's a wonder the start Sonic got didn't hamstring his growth? Well, that's a partial truth. It didn't hamstring his commercial growth, but it did basically kill his ability to ever be taken seriously. Sure, Mario's whimsical and cartoony, but it has a legacy of little but quality and adaptable simplicity. Ratchet, new IP. No legacy weighing it down in the first place. Sonic, though, from the very beginning, was developing a legacy of audaciously bumbling aimlessness. If Mario was your fun but respectable dad, and the new 6th-gen mascots were mysterious and interesting strangers, Sonic was that one kid. His goal in life is to track down the coolest man on campus and say whatever he thinks he'd find the coolest. One moment he's the hero of the town, the next he's a fugitive on the run, the next an epic action hero, and next a laid-back jokester. Today he can be all about living free and letting nothing and no one tie you down. Tomorrow he can eat and breathe, my friends are my power. So when Sonic has something to say, well, we all know better at this point, don't we? It's Sonic. He'll say anything.
Speaking of females, the Sonic universe might also be classified as hot chicken heaven. It's such a mess of very beautiful and tough women that it will make you love the franchise even more.
And you know what? 12 kilobytes of raw text into the script, I've realized that going blow for blow down the entire timeline would get boring fast. You heard enough to get my overall point by now, and if you're even watching in the first place, you're probably familiar enough with the subsequent games to see where I'm going with this. Unleashed was a brief return to form of sorts, colors as self-aware 2010s cringe, and Generations kicked off the meta era proper, by making an anniversary game whose plot and world building are based on it being an anniversary game. And then there's Lost World, a fairly unremarkable game, at least story-wise, with the exception of one introduction that Sega has gone to great labors to convince people is a major one. This poppy playtime-looking muffker is like a corporate talisman or idol of some sort, a visible representation of the spiritual concept that, no matter how many times I knee-jerk on things like overall tone and presentation, they'll never pay direct attention to what people actually want and care about. I don't know, actually, maybe Zavok's like a mega game and villain superstar in Japan or Latin America or something. Be sure to let me know in the comments. So with all that said, why is Sonic such a painful series to be a fan of? Let's run it back and squish it down a bit. From the very first era, there were basically 4 equally valid but completely different avenues to get into and enjoy the series. There were the games, which we'll call, in spite of some heavily Americanized Western marketing, fundamentally Japanese, and also rather light on narrative and dialogue to begin with, by which I mean there is none. There was the Adventures cartoon, which is basically what you get if you skipped on a writing team and just went into a mental hospital with a tape recorder. There was a Sad AM cartoon, which was basically just a Cold War kiddo power fantasy with a touch of environmentalism to make it at least slightly palatable to college stoners. Finally, there was the Archie comics. I'll just put this image back on the screen while explaining that the character featured here was introduced in, not an issue, nor an arc, but an entire Knuckles-centric spin-off sub-series that her creator was given unsupervised creative direction of. What about Sonic Underground? I said there were 4 equally valid ways. Though what I should say is 4 equally valid ways for American fans alone, because while that's Sonic's main market, it's definitely not the only market to get its own homegrown content that was basically nothing to do with the source material. There was also the British Fleetway comic, where Sonic's super form was like a demon that possessed his body for some reason, and Robotnik. Is that? Yeah, it is. This franchise never misses an opportunity to cross its wires, does it? Also, the most cursed part of this comic, it gave us Pinga's Adventure. Pinga's Adventure. Pinga's Adventure. If Pokemon's a masterclass in how to start an unstoppable monolithic brain through a synchronized multimedia push, Sonic's a masterclass in building a race car whose wheels all take off in opposing directions and leave the chassis behind. I once saw an essay that had the audacity to call Sonic a failed mascot, but I'd argue he's exactly the opposite. If Sonic hadn't been such a stellar mascot with an iconically unique design and an aesthetically interesting world, this scrambled start would have crippled him past the Genesis era and signed his death warrant by Heroes. If anything, being an easy mascot for children to attach themselves to, or the other way around, depending on your perspective, is the one thing Sonic has never failed at. Sonic is, was, and always will be cool. But that sort of magic comes at a price. Don't you remember how much cooler Sonic was when you were a kid? Of course you do. That's because no matter when you were a kid, Sonic was doing what was cool at that time. Mostly. To an acceptable degree, we'll say. Mostly. And that's the darker, more sinister side of the Hedgehog's almost endearingly floundering nature. Sonic is fundamentally whatever he thinks will get him into the piggy banks of the most impressionable of audiences. He's a shill at heart, with no commitment to any particular style or demographic, with no real opinions beyond some prefabricated rambles about positivity, friendship, freedom, and believing in yourself, etc., yada yada. The typical kids' movie affirmation shotgun approach, where instead of saying anything in particular to anyone in particular, you just reassure your little pop culture aphids that whatever it is they're doing is probably great. I mean, they like Sonic after all. They must be pretty darn cool, right? But if you recall, I asked 2 questions near the start, and so far, believe it or not, all of this has only been answering one question. If all that's what Sonic did wrong, what did he do right? Why are we still here? Well, there actually is something to be salvaged from his fickleness. While these constant knee-jerks, callbacks, and turnarounds kind of leave us cutting around the canon we dislike to try and salvage what once inspired us, those lucky flukes of inspiration do still exist. They're not going anywhere. If you found meaning in the culture and world building of Adventure 1 or Shadow's Redemption and Sacrifice in 2, the fantastical fun of the classic era, or dare I say the epic narrative and scope and unanswerable questions of 06, those things are still there. Whether some of us or Sega like it or not, there's no taking them back. And in a way, ain't that a beautiful thing? So many interactive worlds and stories with their own flavor and texture and flair that nothing else could ever fully replicate. Even if they could have been approximated by new individual properties, so many more people got to enjoy them thanks to the esteem Sonic had earned early on. So many original creations, in many ways surpassing them, have branched off or at least borrowed elements from the many gameplay and narrative styles they experimented with. Don't get me wrong, I think it's better to stick to your guns than to capitulate, but maybe not if your guns were never that important, deep, or meaningful to begin with. So much would have been lost in a way if Sonic had simply continued dashing with zipped lips for abstract cartoon fantasy scapes forever. You know what? Maybe he's not even quite as fickle as I've led on. No matter what side you take on him, there'll never really be a winning side, but he'll always leave you with something a bit more interesting than just having it your way. Unhappy, unfulfilled, but intrigued. At the end of the day, I guess that's what freedom really means, for better or for worse. And Sonic embodies it like nothing and nobody else.
Boom, you're dead now.
Oh, Amy Rose, how dare you kill Sally Acorn? You're grounded for 1993 years.
Wow. Yeah.